So yeah, I have a couple questions. Read the margin accounts. I mean, there's sort of all this talk about the terms of service. Did you break terms of service? Did you not? You're basically claiming that there was a separate side of your terms of service, which said that if people had margin accounts, you could use kind of their funds, or there was looser language around that. But I talked to somebody from Alameda and asked how big the position of like, or how many people had assets in the type of accounts that that terms of service would apply to versus the regular terms of service, which said you couldn't use their money. And they said it was about $1 billion that was in the margin trading or the margin like side of things where you could reuse their funds or whatever. And there was the rest of it was not there. So does that mean the rest of the money was stolen? I mean, like it seems like you're putting all your eggs behind this one excuse about, there was this separate side of the terms of service. How do you address everyone else?
So I don't have all the data in front of me. My memory is that it was substantially more than $1 billion in the margin trading program. But I don't have that data in front of me right now, so I can't verify that. Um, on top of that, there were other effects as well. And I don't have the data about all the details of those in front of me, but my understanding is that some of those were uh, early wire transfers sent directly to Alameda, which I think contributed to the position as well. And then there are open futures positions on top of that, on top of the spot margin positions, where there can be effectively socialized losses clawbacks if one is unable to be closed um, in time. And so I think it was a combination of those factors. Um, there may have been other factors too, but that's what I've been able to piece together. And that putting those together, I think is likely how you got to most of this, um, uh, but
But
again,
here's the thing. How do you account for maybe the difference in what people are hearing from insiders who are not being accused of fraud and you who sort of is? There's a very different sort of story going on here where you're saying like, oh, there's this big position that we didn't know about because you told me that the last time we spoke in a space, and I went and followed up and I said, hey, is this true? Could it be that this number just wasn't known about? And some Alameda insiders said, no way. You could see on dashboards really simply where it was. And FTX dashboards, not Alameda dashboards, dashboards that you yourself had access to. So my question is sort of like, it seems like when I go to Alameda insiders or FTX insiders, they're saying this story makes no sense. But when I go to you, who sort of has every incentive to sort of lie and obfuscate, because obviously the incentive here is, well, otherwise you might go to jail, which obviously would be a very bad thing for you. It seems like all of a sudden all the excuses come out, and then when we follow up on them, they don't seem to be true. So I don't know, like, help me square this, because it'd be nice if you were telling the truth, but everything we're hearing from insiders is that you're not.
I don't know what to tell you. I'm saying what I believe. I don't know which insiders you're talking about. I don't know exactly what they said. It doesn't line up with my beliefs, but I can't speak to what they think or what they said.
But
I'm
why are
sorry I can't give
multiple
you
people
more, but
within your company at less senior roles knowing more about the company than you?
and Alameda was not a company that was running at the time. But I hear you. I'm sorry. I don't know exactly what you're referring to. I don't know who you're talking about. I don't know what they said. Um, I don't,
Well, I'm telling you what some of what they said. I mean, for
and
example, one of
I
them was
know,
that there was like that backdoor system or whatever. A, that you knew it existed, and B, that it was easy to see the balance or the position of Alameda very simply on FTX dashboards because they
uh,
had a margin trading account with you guys, so you guys could have seen it.
but,
You guys
uh,
could see the margin positions of
but,
everybody. No,
but a lot of the position did not appear in that main account.
so where was the position?
It was in a separate stub account, I believe, related to wire transfers that had been sent, to Alameda Research, generally primarily to FTX, having its own bank accounts.
So who controlled the secret stub account?
I
Did
I'm
anyone at Alameda know about this secret stub account? I mean, are we supposed to believe that just like there was this stub account that nobody knew about?
I don't know who knew about what when. I'm sorry.
I mean, clearly somebody lost the money, right? Like, obviously the money went somewhere. Somebody lost it. It just seems really convenient that $8 billion was located in this like account that didn't show up when you pulled up Alameda's balances, right?
Yeah, I don't know what to tell you.
Okay, so a separate question is obviously around this Forbes thing because you've said you don't have present knowledge of sort of like Alameda's balances, and they came out and said that you were giving them up to date balances from Alameda. How do you square that? Just as of a month ago, you knew Alameda's position. How does
I was
that
giving.
square with your statement about like you don't know what's going on?
I haven't seen the thing that you're referring to, but I was able to give very rough approximations that included a subset of the list of assets that Alameda had. Um, I by asking about the assets I believe to be the largest sets of them. I was not giving full accountings. Um, I of all of Alameda's balances or positions, because I didn't generally have those, and because it was a complicated process dependent on liquidity of tokens and things like that from the Ford's perspective. So I was just sending them a sort of abbreviated partial list of Alameda assets periodically.
But that means you knew that what Alameda had, even roughly, you knew what Alameda had.
I had a rough sense of what their assets are. That is correct. By rough, I do mean to within $10 billion or so. I did not have a fine grained sense of what their total asset value was, and I did not have a fine grained sense of their liabilities or of their margin position size or how that was split up.
I guess one of my questions is like, what do you think should be done if we find out that you're lying about all of this? Like, sort of, because it's kind of one thing to steal people's money; it's another thing to lie about it. What do you think should be done? Like, because I mean, it's going to be obviously a lot of this is going to eventually get litigated. Eventually Caroline Ellison's going to have to take the stand. What happens if she pulls out text messages that shows you knew about it? I mean, do you think that wipes away your credibility?
I mean, I think a lot of my credibility has already been wiped away, frankly. And
I think that's fair.
honestly, that's not what I'm thinking about right now. I'm not trying to focus on, my I'm just thinking about like customers here who I think are what matter.
So you're saying there's a chance for them to get money back or for us to get our money back?
I don't want to speak out of turn, and I can't make promises on behalf of the company. I can't speak on behalf of the company. And I don't know what decisions everyone's going to make. I do know that FTX US, to my knowledge, is totally solvent and could, I think, return everyone's money tomorrow if it wanted to. And I think internationally, there are a lot of pathways, potentially forward there that one could imagine FTX International taking. I think, I know that as of before I filed, there were billions of dollars of serious funding offers potentially on the table, and I would expect and hope that those are being deeply
Who are those
explored.
funding offers?
I don't know that I have authority to say.
Well, you said you had $4 billion
Yep.
that came in, right?
Yep.
Is that still does that still exist? Was that ever real?
I think it. I mean, I think it. I don't know for sure, but I think that some of those might. It. I. My guess is that some of them might. That and I. You know. I hope that the sort of relevant teams are doing whatever they can to maximize value for customers here.
Yeah, it just kind of doesn't make a lot of sense why someone would pour $4 billion when you guys have liabilities sort of as high as you do. Can you talk a bit about the mark to market like statements you were making around solvency. You're making some pretty outrageous statements about like FTX, had the money when a lot of it was Serum, FTT, these tokens that you can't sell in those amounts, and that would completely crash the price. They can't support that kind of selling. Were you kind of deliberately misleading people there?
So what I can say is I was just thinking about them in terms of, their market price was just whatever their market price was at the time. And, obviously I was cognizant of the fact that, that, you can't, the market price isn't necessarily, is never, what you could sell a large amount of something for. But I also massively misjudged that discrepancy there. And
what do you mean you massively misjudged it? Because you knew sort of roughly the percentage of Serum and FTT you held, and you knew the trading volume. I mean, you are a smart guy. You're a professional trader. There's no way you make a simple mistake like that, right? Like, how's that even possible?
I mean, it was a pretty big misjudgment and mistake that I made, and a pretty embarrassing one. But I was thinking of it internally in the context of standard market environment, and obviously that still means, substantial impact. But it's a different scale than what you would see, than what we did see in the market crash that happened, where, without selling, without liquidating the position, there was a, much larger than 50% market crash in a few day period, with, very little bid-side liquidity. And, that obviously history has said again and again that those events are possible, those very correlated market crashes, and not just very correlated market crashes in those instruments, but ones where hedges don't end up working fully or even
right,
much
but
at all.
we don't even need to have this market crash for the statement about mark to market accounting making no sense, right? And you just said that yourself. Even with standard movements, right? If you tried to sell the amount of Serum or FTT that you had on the books, you wouldn't have gotten half. You wouldn't have gotten a quarter of what you put on your books to investors. And so the question is like, we know that you're not. The problem is like every time it comes to this hard point, the answer seems to always be, I made an embarrassing mistake. But at what point are you going to say like, no, I'm a smart guy, right? You were at the highest levels of this entire industry. You were the guy to go to, the smartest guy in the room, right? It's hard to believe that you made this many embarrassing mistakes. One embarrassing mistake, I get it. But everything's an embarrassing mistake. At least tell us that you knew that the mark to market made no sense.
And the way that I was thinking about risk at score was starting with mark to market and then adjusting down effectively from that. And obviously that means that there should be a real buffer because of exactly what you're saying. That buffer should have been a lot larger than I was thinking of.
But you never went down from risk from there. And you said publicly, FTX is solvent. Other views may differ. Well, there is no other view on it. There's the fact of how markets work, and you were making public misleading statements. It wasn't one time you did this. You continued to make misleading statements about it after people had given you pushback.
Sorry,
So
which times are you talking about here?
I think it was in one of your follow-ups about the what happened. You said something about other views may differ.
Oh, that was FTX US, was it not?
I'm going to look it up real quick. I'll follow up.
In the meantime, Cash 22, you have a question?
I got a quick question about Dan Friedberg, your chief regulatory officer. This is a guy. Obviously,
I don't feel comfortable like talking about other people without getting sort of their sign off on that. So I think there's a limited extent to which I'm going to be willing or feel comfortable speaking on others' behalves.
No, that's totally fair. And I don't want you to speak on his behalf, obviously. I want you to share your perspective, your unique perspective on the situation. Just like the same, I might ask a question about Caroline Ellison, but I only could
Right.
expect your position on the situation. So, kind of the situation there is obviously this is sort of a tale of two stories about how FTX failed. One is like a lack of regulation, a lack of clarity, the kind of just this thing that accumulated over time. The other one is, of course, a story of fraud. Of course, we have to look at who were the adults in the room. One of the adults, obviously, was Dan Friedberg, chief regulatory officer. I'm sure you're aware he was behind the ultimate bet scandal where he gave players God mode in a poker game where people could see the hands, and he actually like basically conspired with Russ Hamilton to hide that. So, does that suggest something about your intention that you hired a guy that basically one of his biggest achievements was hiding fraud? Can you explain sort of your thinking? I know you don't want to talk about him. Can you explain your thinking about why this would be the guy you choose as the chief regulatory officer?
Um, we had a number of people in the legal department. We had that was maybe our fastest growing department. We had a number of outside law firms as well. Dan was obviously one of the people who had been working for FTX for a while.
He's the chief guy. He should have caught some of this stuff, you'd think, in theory.
Well, when you say he's the chief guy, I mean there's we also had general counsels. We had other positions as well, but um I but I can't speak to what other people's views were, what they thought or knew or were intending when but I know that like our legal and regulatory team had an enormous task in front of them. We were looking to get licensed and regulated in dozens of jurisdictions at once. We did end up doing that. That was an unbelievably large undertaking, which I think took up most of the time of most of our legal and compliance departments. And in retrospect, I think probably took up too much time. But at the end of the day, I was CEO, and that means that at the end of the day, it's on me to make sure that we have people who are in charge of all of the important things. And I did that for some of the areas. I failed to do that for others. And
But why'd you choose him specifically? I mean, obviously, you could have chosen a lot of different lawyers to go with. And I understand you had multiple lawyers, but if this story of FTX is largely a failure of regulation, a failure of controls at an organization, and your chief regulatory officer is Dan Friedberg, the question is, well, maybe this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't put a guy like this in front of this. I'm not obviously saying it's his fault solely, but I'm just asking sort of what was the thinking behind putting this guy in charge? Because it seems like you couldn't pick a less qualified candidate if you want to get actual regulation in the room.
I'm pretty I didn't say this was a failure of regulation. And we did an enormous amount of work on getting licensed and regulated. We're licensed in more jurisdictions than I think any other exchange was. I think it was absolutely a failure of oversight of risk management. Um, but I, but you know, and I think that in retrospect, I would have viewed the core duties and things I needed to make sure of more so than anything else very differently than I did. But from a becoming licensed perspective, we did do quite a bit there, and were able to accomplish that in in a fairly short period of time. And so I think I'm not sure that I completely agree with the premise of that framing of the question. And I'll just say that like the people who work with FTX, like I have enormous respect for most of them, and they did enormously valuable work. And they didn't do all the work. Obviously, there are really important things that didn't get done. But that's on me as CEO to make sure that there are people who are doing all of the important things, because there's way too much to do. we're doing way too much as a company for any particular person to be expected to be definitely on top of even of some important things, given how many other important things they also had to be dealing with at the time. And by the way, I do apologize. I am fairly late at this point. For next thing, I do have to hop off.
Sam, thank you so much for your time, and Coffeezilla and other speakers. Thank you so much, Marty. Everybody, thank you so much for your questions.